This is part 2 of the video lecture on Chapter 8, which is climate change. I had to end the last lecture a little bit quickly because I was running out of time, but we were talking about the consequences of global warming and climate pattern changing. So some areas will be drier, some areas will be wetter. The melting glaciers and ice sheets, which of course will create more land space, but also it will, remember, as those glaciers melt, they'll change the salinity of the ocean. We definitely have to worry about rising sea levels. Most of the world's population lives very close to an ocean because that is a supply of food and water, and not water, but because you can't drink ocean water, but usually it's for bathing, cooking, etc. And so as these sea levels rise, we will lose land. So we'll gain some land where the glaciers were, but then we also will lose some land. And of course, this will cause changing populations and ecosystems. So ecosystems, flora and fauna will change because they may not be able to survive where they are located now. And so this is just kind of showing you over the past several decades, the northern ice cap has steadily has been shrinking since 1965. Global warming has produced a steady decline in the extent of summer terrestrial snow cover, which is what's in blue, and ice, which is what is in red. So this is where it was, and then it declines back. Okay, so the red line shows you that. And so we've had major issues. This is over a 30-year period since 2002. Warming has caused ice shelves the size of the state of Rhode Island to begin to collapse. And so we've seen a lot of this. And a lot of this, we've also seen that the measurements in sea level rise have increase. So this shows you how in millimeters since 1994 to 2006 we have seen a significant increase in sea level because those glaciers will melt and then of course add water to the oceans. We have seen places like the Maldives. There's a wonderful documentary on Netflix about the Maldives and the destruction of them, but we will see the Maldives and a lot of other island nations will no longer exist because sea levels will rise. We also talk about these species. This is for example, the pied flycatchers from Africa no longer matches the peak abundance of insects. So the flycatchers have insufficient food for nesting. So you'll notice that a lot of different species are nesting earlier or later, and they might have changed their migration pattern lines to deal with climate change. Sorry, let me move that back again. So these are a lot of the issues with climate change, the consequences of climate change. So how can we predict the future? Well, computer simulation is really what we can do. It's not completely accurate, but it does give us a ballpark estimate, which is kind of what we need. Accuracy is checked by what we call backcasting, which is using past records. It's very hard to find specific places. The most accurate for large areas such as continents and oceans, so we can kind of tell you what areas are going to be hit and how they're going to be hit, but it's really hard to tell you specifically what it is. Like for example, we may be able to say that, especially in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, we might get more of the Atlanta type climate, so that tells you what that is. But we might not be able to tell you exactly what's going to happen in Philadelphia. So here is what we need to look at. What are we doing today? What's business as usual? What's a sustainable world? And if we stay business as usual, the government takes actions to reduce emissions, just minute ones, we'll see a 4% increase. If we try and live in a sustainable world, we'll do a 1.8 degrees Celsius increase by 2100. But if we're committed, then we'll see a very small increase per decade. And of course, this is what we really want to do. But everyone would have to be committed to this. And under the current administration, presidential administration, I see no signs of a committed warming. What I see is business as usual. So we'll definitely see an increase. One of the big problems with business as usual is It's going to be catastrophic. The average temperature increase will be 810 degrees Celsius and sea level will rise 1 meter. And so this is a big deal. It's going to cost us a lot of money as nations as a whole to relocate people, to build different kinds of structures to adapt. So this is a big problem in the world today. One of the biggest problems I see is that all those people the billions of people who live along oceans are going to have to relocate. When they relocate, don't forget, they're bringing their cultures and religions with them. And what I think one of the biggest problems with climate change is that we can definitely build high rises, we can definitely adapt, but one of the biggest things is that we can't really solve cultural differences. And when we move people who aren't of specific cultures or nationalities or races and put them into other areas, people become very territorial over their land. And what I see as one of the biggest results of climate change will be civil wars. That will be one of the biggest issues with climate change. So we have a lot. So there are some things we can do by mitigating. So we can mitigate climate change, and that is we can do efficiency and conservation. We can become more transport efficient, meaning improving miles per gallon per vehicle, using more electric vehicles, but of course the electricity needs to be produced through solar power. We can increase our mass transportation. We can build more efficiency, LEED certified buildings. We can have efficient electricity production. So there's lots of things that we can do to mitigate climate change. We can change the types of fossil fuels that we use. We can capture CO2 emissions, and what some people's objective of doing that is actually they would take the CO2 and pump it back into the ground again. Now, what the consequences of that are, I'm not sure, but that is one of the alternatives to it. We can also, of course, use renewable energy. We can reduce our carbon footprints to zero. We can try and go CO2 zero, which a lot of places are trying to do, is that you can calculate your carbon footprints and you can change your carbon footprints. You can do all of these things. And that's ways that you can mitigate CO2 emissions. We can, of course, switch to nuclear energy. Well, we use nuclear energy now, but we're trying to decommission a lot of these nuclear facilities, and I'll talk more about that in non-renewable energy in the next upcoming chapters. We can biostore, we can store carbon in forests, etc. So these are ways that we can mitigate climate change. Ways that we can adapt to climate change are that this means that we just say, we know there's inevitable change, which I believe this is where we are, is that if the current administration doesn't embrace climate change and change their beliefs on it, and then we change our beliefs on it, we will just have to learn to adapt to climate change. And what we'll do is we'll have to understand that some areas are going to become drier. We're going to have a lot more droughts. We're going to have to conserve water. There's going to be some areas that increase in flooding, and we're going to have to change infrastructure. We're going to have to understand that increases in heat is going to happen. We're going to have crop losses. We're going to have to learn how to farm differently. So these are ways that we can adapt to climate change. Patterns of storms, we'll have to understand that the Jersey Shore might be gone. We'll have to understand that, some areas are going to be really cold, some areas are going to be really hot, and there's going to be these regional distributed capacity to adapt. Might be harder in some areas than in other areas. We have to be accepting of other people's cultures and religions. So there's a lot that we would have to do to adapt to climate change or global warming. So lots going on. So here is it. If we stay as is, it's going to cost us 4% of the GDP, which is about $2.6 trillion. So it's actually going to cost us money, because remember, we have to put in all those adaptative ideas. So this is a big problem if we decide to do that. But if we move to a sustainable world, it'll only cost us $1.3 trillion. So that's a huge difference, is that the upfront cost might be there, but we will suffice in the long run. Okay? So remember, we might have to pay out of pocket first. The government might have to pay out of pay out of pocket first. We might need to invest in new technologies, but in the long run, it will save us money. Now, we have tried to do some policies. We've tried to implement policies and regulations to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We've tried to give people tax incentives to buy electric vehicles, to put energy efficient air conditioners in their home, to do all of those things. But there's also, there are other things that we could do. The Kyoto Protocol, the G8 summit. Most countries have signed on. The United States has withdrawn itself from climate change regulations and policies. So this is a big deal. And we have major problems with it. So we as an administration and as the United States need to push our administration to accept and understand that climate change is happening. We need to stop debating on the reasons for it and instead accept that it's happening and worry about the consequences of it. Okay, so this concludes my PowerPoint on climate change.